I want to talk about in my, I have 15 minutes left so I can really ramble on this one, is breathing apparatus. Again, a project that's in our lifetime, not only in our professional, but in everyone's lifetime here. I can talk about SCBA and respiratory protection back from when firefighters had beards, and they soaked it in beer, and they stuck it in their mouth, but I'm not going to do that. Only because I'll give people some thoughts on what to do in the future with beer and beards. But I am going to talk about the history of it real briefly. In 1969, every fire department in this country was wearing respirators. Type N, they were wearing canister masks. That was the respiratory protection. There was some of the old World War II masks, but breathing apparatus didn't really exist in the fire service. In the late 60s, we had firefighter fatalities in New York and Boston, where they didn't die from the exposure, they died from the oxygen-deficient atmospheres, and they actually were in there. The major manufacturer right then, rightfully so, said, hey, we make a good mask, these canister masks are light, people warm, and so forth, but they have no business in the fire service, and they were basically overnight yanked from the use for firefighters. What did they have to rely on since 1960, after that happened? Basically nothing. It took many years for firefighters to move into SCBA. And in fact, when I started at the IAFF, people still weren't wearing it. I mean, there were demand masks out there. There was very few, what they called back then, mandatory mask rules. Can you imagine that today? That they actually argued on mandatory mask rules, and it was a discretionary issue, respiratory protection of the fire service. Part of the Project Fires program, or just prior to the Project Fires program, in fact, the first issue that NASA worked on in the mid-70s, and it came out in the late 70s, was a firefighter's breathing apparatus system, where they brought fire service people again and said, hey, not only do we have to move to a breathing apparatus, but if we're going to use SCBA, we can't put firefighters on these 38-pound, half-hour steel cylinders, which were the breathing apparatus out there. And we did work with NASA, and NASA funded this program, not only worked for astronauts, but worked for the fire service. And in 4 years, we came out, which basically then became the Scott 4.5 SCBA. Again, I'm not taking any credit away from Scott, I'm just Scott folks here. But again, that was a project designed by the fire service, which came out. Scott became the vendor, and then the other manufacturers moved that in to both hoop wrapped and then now composite cylinders, and then a new cylinder, which I'll talk about as I end here today. I have 1975 here, it's the wrong date because Bruce and I are arguing. 19B was the first NFPA standard on SCBA. It came out in the early 70s, our best remembrance of. And all it said was, this is for an NFPA PPE standard, it said, firefighters shall wear breathing apparatus. It was a one-page standard. NFPA probably charged you $15 for it, but it was a one-page standard. And that's all basically it said. We fought that over the years. We moved into 1980. We had a selector switch, for those who remember the Scott 2 and 2As, with the Don-Doff switch on there. And then finally we moved into the 80s into a positive pressure breathing apparatus. We had to address environmental tests, and we did so. Early on, we took mil specs. We talked about particulate. We talked about heat. We talked about a number of issues. But basically, the committee worked for a number of years in conjunction with Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And there's a gentleman out there, Bruce Held, that was able to steal, better word, able to more correctly utilize, I guess is a better word, money from the National Laboratory to do research on respiratory protection for firefighters. Why? Lawrence Livermore has a fire department inside their national lab out in California. So his premise was if we do anything for respiratory protection, we're doing it specifically for our fire department here, when in reality it benefited the fire service as a whole. We actually were out there for a number of years and built different products to do environmental testing of SCBA and actually developed the flame test. Firefighters work in heat and flames. Why shouldn't the respirator work for that? We did find a couple of interesting little tidbits out there. One, when we first developed this machine that not only heated the breathing apparatus but then subjected it to flame, the first thing that burned up was, and we had a mannequin, half mannequin, which which we put a turnout coat on. Put a turnout coat on it, then put the breathing apparatus on, put it on the breathing machine, subject it to flame and heat, and then hit the flame. Well, the thing burned up. Why did it burn up? Because those you remember in the 80s, the piece of trim that was on every firefighter gear was the vertical trim on your storm flap. So your flap had that vertical trim up there. What happened is when you heated it, well, it became warm. When you hit the flame on it, it ignited. And when it ignited, it burned up the breathing apparatus tube. So what we learned from that project was two things. One, we had to have a heat and flame test for breathing apparatus. And number two, which we've done so, we eliminated vertical trim off the front of the particular clothing. But we did a lot of work. We did vibration tests. We did particulate tests. And we learned an awful lot throughout that process. And the breathing apparatus today truly does represent the environment that firefighters work in. We just have to lighten it up, which I'll get to. The CBRN issues we worked with very closely with the federal government, which initially funded it. NIASH then began that effort, and I've got to give NIASH credit. It took them probably 30 years to update their respirator standards. The CBR standard we were able to get through in about 2 years, which not only gives a respirator that provides you protection from an environment that hopefully no one's ever in, but it made it a better breathing apparatus. I mean, that's what happened when we did the standards for CBRN. We made it that much better. We're moving to a standard now for wildland. I put this up here because in the Lawrence Livermore effort back in the early 80s, we actually developed a respirator for wildland firefighters. Now, people say, well, the issue is where everybody wanted to wear a handkerchief and a bandana around their face, and that was a better protection. That's not true. The problem that we really had back then is even though it was a lighter respirator, canister respirator out there that we believe that wildland firefighters are wearing, the biggest problem that we had was the ember test. It worked very well until you put it in a wildland environment, and then time an ember hit the filter on it, it caught fire. So it was not very useful, even though it would protect your lungs, probably burn your face. But we're moving here. I got to give credit to it. We actually are now working on through the NFPA process on a standard for firefighters.